Hi everyone, welcome back to the React 19 plus Laravel REST API Masterclass. I'm Umesh Rana and I'm super excited in episode 4. Today we are going to master one of the most powerful building blocks in React, which is components. But before we dive in, let's quickly recap what we have covered so far in the series. In episode 1, we introduced our full stack roadmap, how React 19 connects with Laravel APIs. Then in episode 2, we did our complete setup using Vite plus Bun and installed React 19. Further, in last episode, we explored React fundamentals like what is React, why we use it, the DOM versus virtual DOM, basics of components, component types, and how React's data flow works. And now in today's episode, we will dive deep into creating, rendering, and reusing React components. So by the end of this video, you will learn exactly how to structure them, name them, and make your UI modular and clean. If you are serious about becoming a full stack developer, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications because we are just getting started. So here is what we are going to cover in the today's episode. We will start from what are components, then we will discuss functional versus class components via syntax, and then we will set up the folder structure for creating and managing components. Then we will see how we will create our first component, and then we will make reusable to that components via passing props. So we will take a quick overview of props as well. Then we will discuss about some best practices for creating and using components. Okay, so let's start from what are components. A component is a small piece of reusable block of UI. It is just like a Lego block, which will be small, independent, and reusable. So here reusable means write once and use it multiple times, that means in multiple places. So every React application you see, from the header, sidebar to buttons and cards, they are all just components put together. So here in this diagram, you can see we have one header, navbar, section, article, a side and footer component. And these all are combined together to form a complete web page. So for simplification, you can think of your UI as a tree of components where one component can contain many smaller components. This modular approach is what makes React so powerful, because instead of managing a giant HTML file, you build small maintainable pieces that work together. And each components can have on HTML, which is basically JavaScript XML, and there we will have CSS for styling and the separate logic and state management for every individual components. Now you got the basic idea of components. Now let's discuss about types of components in React. So even in the last video, we already discussed about the types of component, but again, let's recall those points. So we have two types of components in React, functional and class-based component. So functional component is a simple JavaScript function which will return JSX. So here again, JSX means the HTML inside JavaScript. And that we already discussed in the last video, right? So this is the modern way of writing JavaScript function to be used as a component in React. This will have the modern supports of hooks like use state, use effect, use memo and all. So regarding the hooks, we will discuss about the hooks in upcoming episodes. Okay. Now let's quickly talk about class-based component. So the class-based component is an older approach of creating components in React. And for creating the components, generally this uses JavaScript ES6 classes and lifecycle methods. But now in the modern ways, these class-based components have mostly replaced from functional-based component. Now let's understand these components through example. So here we have functional components. So the syntax is very simple. This is a simple JavaScript function, just like welcome message. And from this function, this is returning HTMLs, okay? And this is basically JSX. So in the first message, we have one heading 2, H2, and that is returning one message. And further, we have one paragraph element. Again, we have some message, right? And lastly, this component has been exported. That means this function is returning from here. So this functional component syntax is very clean and simplified. Now let's see class-based component. So previously, for creating and using the component in React, we were using this syntax. So here we had to import React and component from React. Then we were creating one class, and that class was extending the base component from React. Then we had to write render function, and inside render function, we had to return the JSX. And again, lastly, we had to return this as a export. Okay. So this was the syntax of class. Now, if you see the differences between the syntax of functional and class-based components, you will find this functional component as more simplified and shorter than class-based component. So in this React 19 series, we will be using functional based component because this class based component is mostly outdated. Okay. So we will be going through the latest syntax and pattern of creating and using components. Now let's quickly talk about folder structure for components, because when we will be creating or managing the components, we will have to keep organize our components by separating it in the folder structure. So let's quickly jump to the project folder. And in the last video, we already created the React 19 application. So I will quickly jump to the code editor. And we already explored the React 19 project folder, right? So inside source, here currently we have main.jsx and app.jsx. So this main.jsx is the main entry point of this React. And further we have one component as app.jsx. And from here, we were returning this heading message, right? So this component was created by default with this React 19 project setup. Now we will create our very first component in React. But before creating the component, firstly, I want to create one folder inside source, which is src, so that we can create and organize our components inside that folder. So let's create a folder inside source. So I will name it as components. Now for naming conventions of folders and files, it is ideal to have small case letters for folders, but it is not mandatory again. Okay. But for creating the component, you will have to use Pascal case. So that we will discuss in the depth. Firstly, inside components, I will create a few more folders, just like layout. So we can organize our components in different directories, just like if it is type of layouts like header, sidebar or footer, then we can keep it in a separate folder so that this component will be reusable. Now in the terms of UI components, like which will be a small block of UI, for example, button, input or some card component, then we can keep and organize those types of component in a separate folder. And also we can keep a feature folder, just like if we are creating a module, just like users module, authentication module, then related to those modules, we will keep a separate folder so that particularly those type of module, we will have the components separately. We will go in more depth. Firstly, we will create a new folder as layout inside components. So I will name it layout. Now inside layout, I will create one component just like header. So I will simply right click on this layout folder and I will create a new file just like header dot JSX. So here, before giving the name to the component file, here I have kept first character as capitalized. So this is a standard naming convention to keep component name in React.js. So you will have to follow the Pascal case. So let's say I have a lengthy name of the component, just like navbar header. Then I will keep it Pascal case. So the first letter will be capital of every word. So as of now, I will create a simple component as header. Okay. And I will hit enter. So the component has been created. Now in order to start writing the code inside component, firstly we will have to define one function. So I will create one basic function, just like function header. So this is a basic JavaScript function. Now from this function, we have to return something. So we will write return statement just like this. Now inside this return statement, we can return any HTML or even mathematical operations. So as of now, I will return some HTML just like h1, and I will write one text as this is a header component in React. Now here we can see this highlighted some error in the red underline, right? Why? Because this said header is declared, but its value is never read. So from here, we will have to export this component so that in other component or file, we can import and call this component. Because in order to get printed this message in the browser, anyhow, we will have to call this function. Okay. So from this function here, we have to return it using export default, and here we have the function name as header. So I will export header from here. Now we have to call this component in some other components so that this function will be executed. Now where we can call this component? So we have the main.jsx. We already discussed about this. This is our main entry component, right? Now inside this, we have the component hierarchy. So in the entry component, we will have a single component rendered. Now inside that single component, we can render multiple components. So that will be the hierarchy of rendering the components. In the root, we will have only one component to be rendered. And then inside this component, we can render multiple components. So firstly, I will just clean up the things from here that we already did in the last video. Okay. Currently, we don't need this strict mode. I will remove it from here. And here in this render function, we have one header component rendered already, which is imported from app.jsx. So better I will change this name as app, because it will create a confusion here because we already created one header component, right? So better I will keep the naming convention proper so that it won't create any confusion. Now in this root, we have rendered this app component, which is imported from app.jsx, which is coming from here. And here we had one function as header, and this was already returning one message, right? And this message was already rendering here in the browser. So again, I will change this name to app, and here also. Now I will navigate to the header component, and from here we created this function as header, and we are returning one message. Now we have exported this. Now in order to render this function or component, we have to import it. So I will import it in the app component, because this is the primary component here as app component, and this app component is being rendered inside main.jsx. So we will call all the components inside app component itself, not in the main.jsx, because in the main.jsx, there will be only one component which will be rendered in the root. Okay. I hope this is clear for you. Now let's call that header component in this app component. So firstly, in order to call that component, we will have to import that component or function in this component. So for importing it, we will have to use import, and we have to give the name that we want to import. Okay, so let's say I want to import header. Okay, and this will be imported from header. So we have folder as components, and then layout, and then header. So this is the correct way to import the component in the React. We have imported this header component. Now in order to render this component here, we have to call it just like we call HTML element. So currently we are already rendering one h1 element from HTML, right? So in the same way, we have to render this header component. So what I want to render this component here in this return statement. So how we will be rendering that? We will be having two elements here. This is already one h1, and we want to render our header component. So what I will do, I will wrap this in this parenthesis, and just before this, here I will try to render that component just like header, and this component will have self-closing just like this. Now this is highlighting one error. If you'll hover over on this said JSX expression must have one parent element. That means currently we have two elements rendering here. One is the component and one is the HTML element, right? So both are rendering separately here. These two are not wrapped in a wrapper. So in React, we cannot render the element separately just like this. Instead, we will have to wrap all the components in a single block. So it could be like div or any parent element. Okay. Now let's say if I want to just comment this h1, then yes, that warning gone now. And if we'll navigate to the browser, and yeah, here that header component has been rendered successfully. Now what if I want to render both just like this header and this element as well? Then in that case, either we will have to wrap it in some div just like this wrapper, so that we will have only one parent element, and there we have wrapped these two, this header component and this element. Now if we'll check out to the browser, yes, both are rendering properly. Now if we'll just open the developer console, and if we'll expand this body element, here inside this primary root div, we have one more div as wrapper, and inside this div, we have this h1 for this header component, and this is for app component. So both are rendering properly. Now React provides one more flexibility. That means if you don't want to create unnecessary div or wrapper in the browser DOM, so instead we will just remove this div, and we will be using empty fragment provided by React. So in order to use the empty fragment, we will have to write in this way. This will be opening angular and closing angular bracket. Okay. And again here while closing this. So this is basically empty fragment in React, which will just create the wrapper for the elements. Now if we'll check out in the browser, if we'll refresh, if we'll expand this hierarchy now inside this div, we can see we have two elements rendered, and now we don't have any errors here. Okay. So instead of div, if you don't want to create unnecessary div block in the DOM tree, you can use this empty fragment. Now we understood how to create component and render it. Now you might be thinking, is it only the way to create component and use it? No, in modern JavaScript, we can define function in more modern approach. So JavaScript ES6 version has given fat arrow function. So this is the traditional way to create the function in JavaScript, right? But in the modern way, ECMAScript 6, that provides the flexibility to create the function in more shorter way. So for that, we don't have to write function. Instead, we can use fat arrow function. So now let's create one more component inside this layout itself. So I'll just right click on this and I will create one component as navigation.jsx. So you have to make sure you are keeping the extension as .jsx. So that will understand as component. Else if we'll keep .js, that will understand this is a basic function, okay, not a component. So now we will create the component in another way using fat arrow function. So what I will do, instead of writing function, I will define one anonymous function using fat arrow function. So here I want to define a function as navigation. But this function will have type, just like if it is type of const, var or something, okay? So I will define const navigation just like this. And here we have this syntax as called fat arrow function. So this is the component name, which is basically a function name. And we have this fat arrow. This is more simpler syntax than traditional function syntax. And inside this, we can return JSX. So from here, I will return navigation, just like home, about, and contact. And then we have to return this function. So for returning the function, either we can use export default navigation, just like this, or we have one more standard way, so that when we will have more than one function defined in a single component, we can use that way. So here what I will do, instead of using export default, I will use export directly in this function, so that this function will be exported directly from this component, which is navigation. Now in this case, we don't have to write export default. Directly it will export this constant type of function, which is navigation. Now let me just comment this export default, and here I will navigate to this header component because I want to import and use that navigation component inside this header. So again, we have this header component here, and after this, I will call that navigation. So firstly, I will just create one empty fragment again in order to render multiple components or HTML here. And firstly, we'll have to import that navigation component. So for importing that navigation component, we will have to import from that navigation. So firstly, from this function, this is returning navigation. So we have to capture the same in form of object. So we will have to extract that in curly bracket. So we'll have to open this curly bracket just like this. And here in between this curly bracket, we have to write navigation, and this will be imported from navigation component, right? Now in the same way, we can render this component here, and we will have this self-closing again. Now if we'll navigate to the browser, and yes, this navigation component has been rendered successfully. Here we have this element hierarchy as h1, and then further we have this ul and li elements. Now here, the way we are calling this component in opening angular bracket and closing, we just call a regular HTML element, right? But here we have the differences. So let's say from here, if I will change this navigation n capital to navigation n small, just like this, and here if I'll change this, this will throw error. So firstly, from that function, from here, we'll have to export in the same lowercase. Okay. Now here we have called this function. Now if we'll navigate to the browser, if we'll refresh, here that navigation component is not rendered and we have one error in the console. So if we'll check out, this said the tag navigation is unrecognized. Now this is understanding this as a normal HTML element. That's why this is saying this is HTML tag, not a component. So the React makes the difference between the normal HTML element and component by using the naming conventions only. So when we'll keep the component name in the lowercase, that will understand that it is a normal HTML and that won't render that in the browser. So that's why we will have to keep the component in Pascal case. So we'll change this to Pascal case. Okay. And also from here. And yes, this is rendering properly. Now we will talk about reusable components. So here in the header, I have called this navigation component. Okay. Now we can call this component multiple times, just like this. And then this component will be executed this number of times here. So if we'll check out in the browser, now we can say we have this navigation component rendered multiple times. Currently this is static navigation, right? So later we can make it dynamic by passing props. So next we will discuss about props. What is props? So props stands for properties. Okay. This is nothing. This is just basic property, just like we use in HTML. So this props let us pass data from one component to another, just like this is similar to function arguments. Okay, because in any function we pass arguments so that based on that given argument, that function will perform actions. So in the same way in React, we can pass props as an argument to that component. So to understand that, let's create one more component here. So inside components, I will create one more folder just like UI. Okay. So inside this UI, I will create one small component that is button. So I will name it as button.jsx. And from here, I will create one HTML button and I will render that. So again, I will create the component using that modern way using fat arrow function. And I will export it by default. Okay. So that we won't have to return export default. So I will create const button and I will use fat arrow function just like this. And from here, I will return button just like this is HTML button, right? And here, firstly, I will name it as click me. This is the button label. And we have to export this component from here. So I will use export. Okay. Now I want to import this component in the header component. So just after this navigation component, here I will import that button component. So again, I will use curly bracket because I have exported this component using export const, not export default. So here you will have to understand the difference. When you will use export default from this component, you are exporting only one. But when you have to export multiple functions from a single file, you don't need to specify default export from here. So in this pattern, we can export multiple functions from the same file. So let's say later, if I want to export input radio button or something, then from the same file, we can export it from here. And while importing it, we have to import it from this curly bracket. So I will write button from UI button component. Okay. Now I will call this button component after this navigation. So again, for calling this component, we have to open this and we will have to write self-closing. Now if we'll navigate to the browser, and yes, this button is rendered here. Now I want to call this component multiple times with different label. So let's say initially we have this label as click me. Now if I will duplicate this button, and now if we'll check out, we have this button rendered as 2 times, right? Now for the second button, I want to change the text of this button as submit. But here we have passed this button label as static click me. And that's why the React introduced props, so that for every components, we can make it reusable for different aspect by passing the props as a parameter. Okay. So here I want to pass the props. So this props is not a predefined name. This could be anything which you will define here. This is not like predefined HTML attribute, just like we write name, placeholder or something, right? This is a custom attribute which allow the flexibility to pass argument in that particular key. So let's say for this button, I want to pass the label in a key like label. So in the label, we have to pass in the string because we are going to pass data in the form of a string, right? So I will pass this as submit. Now in order to capture this props here, we have to receive it in this function itself, which is button. So in this parenthesis, we have to receive that. So for receiving that props, we have to open curly bracket just like this. This is object syntax, and we have to receive in the same key that we have passed from here, which is label. So let's capture it in label here. Okay. Now we have to render this label here between this button. So for rendering any variable in React, this provides curly bracket syntax just like this. And here we can render this variable as label. Now if we'll navigate to the browser, and here we can see for the first button, we don't have any label because for the first button, we have not passed any props, right? But for the second, we have the text as submit. So in case if you don't want to pass the props for that first button from here, then you can set the default value from here. Then we can use pipe symbol and we can set one string as default label just like click me. So this will work like if label is there, then this will display that dynamic label, else this will display static as click me. Now if we'll check out, yes, for the first button, we have not passed the props dynamically. So that's why this displayed click me. And for the second, we have passed the props dynamically. That's why it displayed submit. So we got the basic idea of props, right? How to pass props between the components and how to create and render the components in different ways. Now we will talk about best practices for components. So as I already discussed, always use Pascal case for component names and files. And regarding the component, just try to keep them small, just like we do in a normal function. So we try to keep our function much smaller so that it will be more maintainable and clear to debug. So that each function or each component should do one thing well. Next, you should avoid deep nesting. That means for the big component, you can break it into smaller components. And the most important thing is use meaningful names. That means if it is header that represents the website header, then it should be header. Not just like my component, component one, my thing, something, okay? So that will create a confusion. So while creating the component, just try to keep meaningful name so that later when you will use that components in multiple places, then it will be helpful to use that component and that purposes. And also regarding the folder structure, we will discuss more, but You can organize logically. Okay, so let's quick recap what we have covered in this session. We understood what components are, how to create and render them, the difference between functional and class-based components. Further, we saw how to reuse and compose components, and we saw basic uses of props. Now in the next episode, we will take this to next level and we will explore props and data flow in React, and we will dig deeper into how components communicate and share data efficiently. So if you learned something new today, don't forget to like this video, subscribe and turn on notifications, because we are building this full stack journey together from React to Laravel APIs. You will find all the source code in the descriptions, and if you have got any questions, drop them in the comments. I reply to almost everyone. So until next time, keep coding, keep learning, and I will see you in the next episode where we will master props and data flow in React. So once again, thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.